Right, so this is a big video, so please get comfortable. I hope it's interesting. Hello YouTubers, this is the noobifier. As I detailed in a previous video, which is linked up for you right now, my wife and I have sold, are building, and are moving. This will surely result in the best quality of life for us, but also provide me a special opportunity to minimize all of the tiny compromises within the current studio's design. The current studio began as and continues to be a labor of love, expanding to suit the needs with a significant effort from friends for both construction and decoration. Special shout out to both Kyle and Sarah. As I said, you should look out for video 1, which will explain the what and why, but also the how and a couple of pitfalls that you should avoid. Now to the best stuff, the build. With the plan planned and permits permitted, Everbuilt Group was in full force. A team made up of teams, each aware of what the other's doing, and as you're going to see, pro. I'm going to wind the clock back a little bit to the work that was done just before we physically owned the land, and this video hopefully will turn out to be the most generally interesting video published on the channel to date. For some reason, people seem to universally love watching the process of building, so please share the video with anyone and everyone as I share in detail the steps used to build the house. Let's begin on the 18th of July 2024. Here's what the land looked like before any piece of machinery or hand tool touched it. There's no power, there's no well, and there's no septic. We were told that at one point there may have been a brickworks on site, and after months of exploring it became evident that at one point there was probably a small farmhouse on the site, north in a clearing. You have the regular rocks piled into rows where you would expect them from being on an old farm plot. There were electrical fences in various states of repair, some barbed wire. There was discarded plastic wrap called silage in places, deadfall all over, lots of overgrown foliage. So a lifetime's worth of work lay available for us. We asked the previous owner if he would remove some of the items such as the horse trailer, the hay that was his, which was stored in the coverall, and also if he was interested in taking up the miles of wire for the electrified fencing. In less than one day, he'd achieved all of these things, so thanks very much to him for that effort. On the 4th of August 2024, with the help of our new zero-turn Ego mower, I was able to path out access to the forest, which is on the north half of the property. This is a 500 by 100 meter forest that at one point had a path carved through it that would have been cared for. Years of deadfall and a bit of growth needed to be looked after, and what a great way to spend a day or two. So I was very proud of my new path because I actually used a pair of stakes and a wire as a guide to get that path perfectly straight. Almost like foreshadowing for the entire rest of the build, I didn't know that 2 days later, the Everbuilt Group was planning to completely invalidate all of my efforts in linear perfection by clearing the entire lot with machinery. They actually repeatedly did this to me all summer, and I will explain in better detail. I would, let's say, cut a small path which took me an hour, and they would, with machinery and hydraulics, cut everything, like 4 acres of everything in about an hour. I would spend 5 hours cutting down 2 down trees, and they would, with machinery and hydraulics, clear out a linear kilometer of dead trees in about 3 hours. Not only clear them, but clean the ground and stack the trees nicely into a pile for a future burn. And as I said, this is a trend. There's a race between man and machine wins all the time. On the 6th of August, a Kubota with a grass hog leveled all of the tall grass, weeds, small trees. It was so quick and so effective, so I do understand why these machines command such a high cost. This was needed to prepare the land for the next step, which was to remove the organic layer around the build site. The ground would need to be moved away, revealing a more compacted layer. This grade is the soil base which we would want the foundation to rest on, and this is said to be called the active zone, which could be clay, but it is undisturbed compacted soil in our case. It's not as simple as just digging down until you find something, because the excavation is obviously methodically done considering the final height of the structure, which kind of dictates what the landscaping around the area would need to be or become. The volume of dirt can be sourced locally, but if the proper construction material is not available, then that would need to be trucked in, which is one of the things that the builders mentioned when we were choosing the land. They said it should be favorable and good because there was a great chance that the soil was favorable and good for building. After the top was removed and relocated, they dug about 20 test holes all over, about 4 feet down, with a small excavator. There was a survey team later that day to take samples and produce a report. The report did come back as favorable in general, but I was warned off that there were still specialized land types that would need to be brought in by truck, specifically a very, very special sand that's used around the septic tank, and of course several types of gravel. The base of the driveway was made up of large dark gray chunks of shale, and this split up and dug into the active zone. Above this, there was what I think was called one clear, which locked into the shale as that was compacted. I saw some rocks that had some more rounded edges and several other types of crushed stone at different sizes with or without what was called screening, which is basically just with or without the rock dust. All of this was so new to me and quite fascinating. On the 7th of August, we had loosely marked off the perimeter of the build with stakes and rope. This would guide the rest of the landscaping prep. Irrelevant to the build, we had our first true visitor to the property. The mega internet sensation TV Liquid and his wife, Miss Liquid, spent some time with us. Baby Liquid got a ride on the lawn tractor, and I know this might seem like fluff, but it's important to acknowledge that along with the build, the final point was people coming to spend time and days where my wife and I would just wake up, grab a coffee, and then just pick a spot and do something. A lot of our August was spent mowing, trimming, falling dead trees, and burning. I realized that I could drag full logs with a tow strap behind the lawn tractor rather than carrying smaller logs. Daily fires were the standard as more sectors of the property got cleaned up, raked up, or otherwise sorted out. None of the wasted time ever seemed like a waste because in just under a year, this entire space would be our new home. 23 August, I finally replaced my little DeWalt 20-volt chainsaw with something a little bit more capable. The Ego 20-inch is electric. Compared to anything else that I've ever used, this is the equivalent to using a lightsaber against trees. May end up doing reviews on all of these new tools on Noobifier 2 or a new channel that I have thought about calling the Noobifarmer. On the 30th of August, it seemed as if hell broke loose. With a pair of Kubotas working the landscape, there was a steady wave of dump trucks delivering gravel. It was quite impressive to me, but I didn't know at that time what other future deliveries might look like. I noticed there was a common process, which was remove the grass, cover that with big chunks of shale pieces, and then cover that with gravel. Having screen or no screen, all of these factors changed how the material would compact and how it would survive traffic. The gravel for a road might be different than the gravel used for a footing or a foundation. The gravel that would be used over infrastructure, such as buried pipes, may have rounded edges, and of course, there's an entire other discussion for the different types of sand. Throughout the day, as more material were added, we ended up with a majestic wedge to nowhere, and this would lead into what would become the garage. This gravel wedge would also set the base height for the house floor, the studio floor, the patios, and the surrounding grass. The builders had found the active zone where the footings would be. The house was raised a little bit more than the original plan to help with the septic planning. The plan was submitted for approval, and I quite like the idea of the house being higher as I got more used to the idea of that. Spending the last 3 months around that space, I'd always just assumed that the ground level was where the house would be, but lifting the house up made it so the septic wouldn't need any kind of pumping system, but it also meant that the entire house would be supported on top of several meters of gravel. Drainage and flooding would never be a concern, especially as there was never going to be a basement. The next day was the 31st of August, and that was hilarious. It had rained fairly hard the night before into the morning. The result was that the normally beautiful plot of land had become some kind of greasy mud ball. The builders, as if they'd planned for that, based on experience, had ordered a consistent and constant stream of dump trucks. I thought that yesterday was a lot of gravel, but today would eclipse that order no problem. A dump truck would arrive and dump, and then a pair of Kubotas worked to move that gravel onto the farm trail, thus making the base of our driveway. Dump trucks and cement mixers are heavy machinery, but I was told that the owners don't have time to get stuck and they don't like getting the trucks more dirty for nothing. I was also told they would not drive down a street where trees are dragging across the paint. The next day, September 1st, Pete had a new tool on site which was attached to his mini excavator specifically to tackle this tree issue. The tool was where the bucket would normally be, but it worked more like a hydraulic hand. He was able to grab onto an entire tree near the base, work it back and forth like a tooth, and eventually freeing it up, roots and all. Jen was also on site with the John Deere tractor equipped with a 20-ton trailer, I think it was 20-ton, and trees that were excavated were placed onto the trailer. The trailer was dumped into a growing burn pile, which was started quite far from the build site. Rinse, repeat for that entire day, and this is where I really got to see how insignificant a person with a chainsaw was compared to a pair of people equipped with hydraulics. They had that tree line completely sorted out in a day. They were also being very selective to take only the dead or dying first, but also to take those shitty spiky trees and leaving the nice cedars intact, leaving us with a solid road that was large enough for the next stages of the build. The 2nd of September, there was even more work done to the driveway, more gravel was added, and then the compactor rolled up and down. The compactor was actually pretty funny for me because it was like, how much of an effect might that actually have? right? It looks good, but that was answered when I actually took a walk down to check it out. The difference between the rolled and non-rolled gravel was the feeling between walking on grass or walking on cement, like a cement parking lot. The compactor somewhat made a mess of the pretty gravel, but I clearly understood that this was always part of the plan. You place gravel, level it, and then smash it into the dirt to make a base. Even more layers of gravel were leveled over this, and after the build, I assume there's going to be a lot more added to clean it up. On the 3rd of September, the end of the driveway would be widened and reinforced so that traffic wouldn't need to make such a hard 90-degree into the lane. A bunch of work was done down there to remove stumps and trees around the space, leaving us with yet another fun burn pit in the making. On the 10th, I replaced the tow strap that I had been using for a small trailer for the lawn tractor. By watching and learning how important the correct tool is, I know that this small trailer will never give me the flexibility of some of the larger tools, but isn't rolling tires better than dragging trees? The small trailer has a pretty large capacity and it would be great for moving logs, dirt, and gravel around the property in the future. And we would also upgrade this further with a Honda K-Truck from Japan, and we'll just save that story for a little bit later. On the 20th of August, there was a lot of progress for paperwork and permits. I continued to work around the property, clearing brush, picking up waste plastic from the baler, and just enjoying my time in the sun. It was the 11th of October that Jen ordered up a confirmation survey to identify for good where the property stopped and where the new driveway was in relation to it. This ended up being super news as the new survey placed the actual line further to the west by about 3 meters. We were all super relieved because that second property was on the market, and it made all future conversations with our brand new neighbors super easy. The weeks leading up to the 24th of October were productive. We were waiting on the formal build permit, but that didn't stop our builders from finalizing all the footing level, compaction for the soil, placing the gravel, and then based on the final survey, the forms were placed for what would become the final footings. On the 25th of October, the work on the forms was finished, and then a survey team returned to do a final check to ensure that nothing had moved. It's obviously too late to check the footings after it's poured. The pipes for the power run and some others were placed. The cement was then poured into the forms, leveled, vibrated, leveled, and then a little bit of rebar was placed in it for pinning. A mild trench was added to the top and the cement was left to cure. Pete was going to town on this location that would become the septic field. I didn't realize that needed even more engineering than the footings, the grade, but more importantly, the composition of the soil here needed to be spot on or it would fail inspection. Jen explained the plan. It sounded very good and totally over-engineered as usual. The trees were starting to shed their leaves by now, the sun was setting a little bit sooner, and this was a constant reminder that we were about to lose the fight between summer and winter. On the 12th of November, we had a magical delivery. Giant Lego blocks, ICF or insulated concrete forms. Bear with me while I try to explain how cool this is based on my secondhand understanding. Normally, just like footings, time would be invested in building the wooden molds called forms to give structure to the concrete mixture as it cures. This time-consuming process needs to be reinforced and the internal structure becomes a web of rebar, which is placed throughout. Once that job is poured, done, and cured, the forms would need to be removed, but because we're in Canada, another 2, 3, or 4 days would be spent somehow attaching 2-inch styrofoam on both sides of that new wall. All over, everywhere. That's the old way and becomes a big waste of time compared to the new alternative. The ICF is built as a pair of insulation layers joined by a structure element. There are nubs on the top and anti-nubs on the bottom, just like a Lego brick. They're designed to stack and are a one-and-done solution. They are the form, the structure, and the insulation in one step. This was a full 2-day process, and by the end of day 1, there was a nice outline, 1 block high, all around the footing. That was also checked again by a survey. It was cool to look at the footing because based on its shape, you could see where all the load wells would be, where the support columns would be, basically framing for each garage door and some other features on the final house. The next day when I returned, even more blocks had arrived, and the team had them 3 or 4 stacked high. They were all wired together. In some places, they were highly reinforced with lumber, and all of that was done to prevent a blowout as the mass of the pour was added. This was measured out over the survey and then cut to a uniform height. There were some blocks that were just wall and others that had a pattern that would produce a small ledge rated to support the masonry that would be added later to the outside wall. I found all of this work on the 13th of November very interesting, but on the 14th, that would be pour day. Normally, I wouldn't use the word majestic to describe a big truck, but there was some real poetry there watching the pumper truck unfold its main arm and then unfold its secondary arms. It was remotely guided, but the main pour aiming was still done by hand. It was pretty cool that day. I found out that cement mixers were probably bringing in a warmer mixture and that there might be some extra chemicals and additives that were being added to compensate for the temperature. Everything seemed to go totally perfectly. I know as a bystander, sometimes the team makes even small issues look good or look normal. After the pour, using a string as a guide, a team of 2 physically pushed an entire wall back into alignment. I forgot how cement is basically jello, sand, and rocks until it sets, until it cures. Others were following the pour to put a basic level onto it. The interior structure of the wall was a web of rebar, but there were also additional rods added, which I later found out were added to pin the patio and the garage floor. The front porch and back patio would rest upon this outer wall for support, but they need to make sure that they don't displace over the years. So raw bars were sticking out all over the mixture. They would in the future be bent over or cut to length, and I found out the rebar isn't smooth, which prevents it from being pulled free of cured cement. This is also how the 3 bays for the 3 garage doors is going to be pinned to the slab. After a bit of time, I could see other team members detailing the final shape of the wall, and then there was another team which double-checked that, and everything was at the correct level. I always try to stay out of people's way, but it's really cool just to watch standing from a pile of gravel. Pete had once again ordered several stadiums worth of gravel. He and I had joked that we were going to change the units of measure from truckloads to stadiums, as it was a lot easier to visualize. The gravel was pre-positioned by him into the form a couple days before to speed up the process and make everything easier. It would be easier to add a little bit here and there rather than working to move all of it over a fresh wall. On the 16th of November, the dark gray color was replaced by a lighter gray. Pete and Dan were on site grading up the drive lane up to the garage and doing a final level on the gravel base that would support the slab. The slab mostly floats within the styrofoam-lined walls that were just poured. The slab also sits above a layer of styrofoam. Just above the foam, they add a grid of rebar for structure, and then attached to that would be the 4,653 miles of plastic tubing. Tubing is the core of the in-slab heating, and that would be throughout the 6,000 square feet, even into the garage. Eventually, there would be a water boiler on site that would circulate either coolant or water through the tubes based on where the valves are set in manifolds. The plan needed to include a void-in-the-floor heating system for an as-of-yet unannounced simulator system. It's very powerful, very heavy, and therefore very exciting. But exciting things must be bolted into the cement, or they become even more exciting as they flip over and move around. We didn't want to pierce the new expensive heating system with metal anchors, so it was more intelligent to pour with an 8x8 foot section where there would be no pipes. Also on the 16th, the septic tank arrived, was connected, and buried into place. The electrical and hoses that would be needed for the well were laid out, and Pete continued to grade the area that would become the final septic field. The 18th of November would be the day that we had our first framed wall. The floor wasn't in place yet, which was said to somewhat complicate the construction of the wall frames. I was told that it's better to assemble a frame on a flat surface, but because of the way the winter was around the corner, the usual order of things was about to change. We would have walls, followed by a roof, and then a floor after. The floor needs heat to cure, and it's impossible to do that without the walls within the winter. All of the wood was laid out. The studs were marked based on the design, which included saddle, cripple, king, and jack studs. These would support the roof, and they would support the headers spanning over openings such as windows and doors. They would also support the sills, which support the window openings from below. I didn't know how little I knew about building until I knew much more than I knew before about building the building. I was excited and honored to be on site and help build the frame. The auto nailer though, that was the real MVP. I can't imagine what it would have been like to hammer all of that manually. With the frame ready, there was some extra bits added to the pressure-treated studs to prevent the frame from kicking out when lifted. Some choice cuts of lumber were on standby to brace it once it was erected, and at least for the first lift, Pete was asked to position his excavator to prevent it from falling over past vertical. 3-2-1 lift, the first wall. The back wall of the studio was in place, and then the short wall to the north was added next. These were braced together, and that was it for the day. On the 19th, when I returned, these walls were cladded with particle board, and I have to say, each day I arrived became a surprise. I didn't want to be in the way, but I also really wanted to see it come together. It's a really big deal, especially after 5 months of planning the layout, not knowing if you built too small or even if you built too crazy. The longer wall along the south side included several windows and doors. It was built like before, but it was much longer and much heavier than others. Work stopped everywhere as anyone who was available was asked to lift. Pete was relentless with his mission to get the land landscaped before everything went below zero. The area north of the septic received some TLC as more trucks or stadiums of sand arrived, and his focus was switching between that and the landscaping. Moving on, the rest of the day was similar, and we were losing light sooner than usual. On the 20th of November, all of the drainage plumbing was placed in the gravel. This is a very precise process with care because if the pipes weren't exactly where they needed to be, your toilet would be in the middle of a room. If you mess up a drain, the shower would be in a wall or a pipe would be sticking out of the wall. Hot and cold supply was also added below the gravel. Walls on the northmost side were framed and cladded, and we had the beginnings of my wife's office. The office has a cool extra detail when compared to its counterpart over at the Payden house. Based on the alignment of the floor plan relative to the driveway, we added a small window that would look down the driveway. So when sitting facing south, my wife could see the field through the trees, but also be able to see all the way down the driveway where the bend is to meet our guests. There were many large yellow boards, and these are engineered joists that span large gaps. I'm actually not sure if they're called joists when installed in a ceiling, but I'm pretty sure they're called that when they're in a floor. They seem to do the same job. I'm not an expert, as I've said many times. These chunky boards are made up of layers of wood pressed together in what I'm assuming is some kind of epoxy. They look like a very fat stack of plywood, and I was excited to be able to finally stand within the frames that would make up the studio. I knew that space would be chewed up a little bit by a corridor that wasn't framed in yet, the utility room, and the recording booth that also needed to be added. During the planning, I actually measured 34 by 30. This wasn't an arbitrary number, but looking at it as a chalk line on the road in front of your suburban castle is not the same as seeing it at 1:1 scale made up of real walls. Majestic and tall, this would become the best place to enable the very best from me. We skip ahead 8 days to the 28th of November. The rear patio had been formed and poured. The entire frame had been completed and all tied together. Over half of the trusses were in place, ready to support the new roof. We didn't have snow yet, but I could tell that everyone was pushing late and working hard to get the most done daily. On the 29th, the cladding was going up over the garage. The front patio had been formed and poured, and more work was done to finalize the grade for the septic field. The 1st of December welcomed the build site with its first dusting of snow for the year. Pete was making all of this landscaping look really easy, and you can really tell what he said about the sand. It seems to pack very easily when manipulated, and apparently it's really good for draining pea water. The outlet from the septic tank goes into a septic field. All of this is planned out in advance and then approved. The final field needs to be inspected again and again before it's covered. The main tube splits into two and then splits again. The long tubes sit on a light grade, but they have holes along the bottom which would spread wastewater out evenly into the sand, into the septic field. Directly below these tubes was wash stone. Directly over these tubes are a material, and that material is there to prevent the tubes from filling up with the surrounding sand. I was told that normally the long tubes are uncapped at the end, but in our case, in this design, they're linked together. The field is split up into two parts. The north part has the tubes, and the south part is perfectly millimetrically graded with all of the expensive sand. You can see how Pete makes this look easy. I got to try this excavator, and no, it would have taken me 10 years of practice to look this good. All of the work was done in the snow in preparation for the inspection, and then it would be covered with normal soil. This place would eventually always be marked off to prevent anything larger than a lawn tractor or a person. So much work was done to make it perfect, and all it would take would be a truck taking a shortcut to ruin it. And of course, I couldn't leave without snapping some shots of the trusses over the garage in the studio. On the 3rd of December, there was a light snow, but there would be even more progress. The trusses over the living space were installed, but all of the peaky bits on top would need to be placed next. It was explained to me that the trusses are oversized for delivery, so they're made in two parts, the trusses and the peaky bits. Since the day before, there was even more cladding. You can see extra bracing that was all being added. And also, I noticed a little detail, some small metal clips that were supporting the cladding, basically joining the particle board panels not only by nails to the frame, but also along the edges. All of this material is rated to take some moisture, but again, there was a real push to get this done so it could be inspected, so it could provide shelter for the slab that would need to be poured soon. The 7th of December would be the next time that I was on site. The peaky bits were added and the roof was fully cladded. The gable roof bits were added and the roof surface had been weatherproofed in preparation for the shingles. As a precaution, the team had covered up both the front and rear patios with particle board, the same cladding that was all over the house. And that would stop any damage from traffic, a falling hammer, or any other unintentional damage. I'm pretty sure that the plan is to leave those in place throughout the entire winter. It was really shocking and alarming to see how quickly the progress was being made. And of course, I could now stand within the house taking in how cool the structure was, how cool and how pretty all of the trusses were. I had seen many of the house plans, but I had not actually seen the truss plan, like the drawing. So now I was able to see how all of the spans rest on the supporting walls and how everything is tied together. Where the roofline edges meet, that needed to be custom constructed on site. And it was also cool to see several teams working on different parts at the same time. On the 9th of December, all of the plumbing was finished and the layers of styrofoam were placed over the leveled gravel. This was possible now because the roof was there to protect the slab as it was being poured, shaped, and allowed to cure. I was asked again to clearly define where the void would be within the floor. There were a couple sketches and some guidelines with spray cans, and that was all that was needed. On the 11th of December, the 3,000 square foot slab was manually placed from a mixer by hand using a fleet of wheelbarrows. The steamy mixture was given a rough level and shape using a 2x4. This was vibrated and then flattened to shape. And after some time to set up, the first of many passes was made with a power trowel. That day began at 7 a.m. and I'm pretty sure that the entire team was there at least until 8. With a propane heater and all of the gaps outside covered with a tarp, the slab was allowed to harden up during the evening. On the 13th of December, I arrived to see electrical had begun. The roof will have lighting around it, and the majority of the shingles were in place, so it would make sense that the soffit team would be on site soon. Inside the building was another story. The first 3,000 square foot slab was looking great with a perfect surface polish. All of the foam and rebar were in place for the second 3,000 square foot pour in the living space. Most of it was being covered over with the pipe runs for the slab heating like what was done in the studio part. The entire floor surface for this house is heated, including the garage. The plan would be to run the garage at a lower temperature to be a little bit more economical, but to be honest, as the boiler is electric and there's a plan to add solar, perhaps the garage is just going to be warm like the rest of the house in the future. The 16th of December was the second pour. The heated plumbing was in place and there was another 7 to 8 p.m. day. The truck began pouring into a fleet of wheelbarrows like before. It was leveled rough, vibrated, smoothed over, allowed to set up, and then polished more with care. The steam wasn't from the heater, it was from the temperature of the material being added to the floor. The entire team pushed very hard to put the perfect finish on the floor, and it was allowed to set up through the evening, just like before. 2 days later, on the 18th of December, electrical would be the next big push, both inside and out, because the sooner we had power, the sooner heat could be switched from gas to electrical. We had discussed the choices about how power could be brought over to the house. It would be a long run from the street no matter how you run it. Originally, we thought it would be best to run along the east side of the lot, over a ditch and into the house. When Ontario Hydro was there, the tech had pointed out difficulty that we really hadn't considered, and that was easement. This is a good story. Easement is basically an agreement from the landowner which would give one party permission to do another something on another's land, such as hook up a wire to an electrical pole. The power runs along the south side of the road, which needs a hookup across the road to a new pole on our side. The tech was super fun. He giggled when he said that he did a quick historical search, and I'm not going to get too far into the details, but he said that we were not ever going to be successful in getting permission from that property without lawyers. So that meant not cheaply and not quickly. This was a huge setback, or it was going to be. But then with a smile and an extended index finger, the tech did point and say, but if you ask me to take power from this pole over here, that already has a transformer on it. So technically, we don't need to get any permission from anyone because that was already previously agreed to. Both Jen, our home builder, and I thought that was just effing hilarious. And it meant that the power would be coming along the other side of the property, across the ditch, and then along the north side of the tree line. This install was originally going to be carried over with hydro poles. A set of poles in the new place would be super ugly and directly over the location for the B school. So new quotes were requested for a below surface service. And now was the time that would be installed. During some planning, the original requested 200 amps was below the needs. Changing the plan would mean a revision to the plan and it would be a super long setback. So the house would be wired for 400 amps as two 200s. The service from the road to the transformer would be wired for 400 amps. The house would be connected at 200 amps, pass inspection to get the heaters heating, and then immediately after that, a new request would upgun the service to 400. Whenever that would be actioned, all they would need to do is pull the transformer and sub in a larger one and then pop out the meter for a more capable one, resulting in a 400 amp service. But that's fine because we needed power now. Could I have a welder in the future? Who knows? Would I have a lot of power tools or a massive compressor? Probably not. But perhaps. The new wire took a crew of 3 people 2 days to dig out. That first day was miserable, so when I arrived, I immediately did a coffee run. Standing in the snow sucks a lot, but digging while standing in the snow sucks more. And we always appreciate the work that's done by others to put our house together. Windows were delivered. Windows, all of them except for one, were installed that day. And the framing was done so well that none of the windows needed much in the way of shimming. It made a huge difference to take down the tarps and get a glimpse of what the view would be in the future. I left and I returned on the 21st of December. It was cold and there was no easy way to deal with it. There was an entire team working that day to get the wires run throughout the house. The main panels were both in place, each with a master cutoff switch. All of that was being done now, so close to Christmas, because there needed to be an inspection before it could be insulated. The heater was doing quite a bit less than before because the barriers were all taken down to run the wires and because you can't inspect things if they're covered up. So I'm not an inspector, but to me, it all looked great. There was an inspection for the trusses and the structure, and then another for the electrical rough-in. Both approved. And the next step in the near future is insulation. As you can see, a lot of work in just 2 months. Everyone who's seen our build and who has also built their own house says the same thing. Your builders are on fire and your house is progressing so quickly. So that would bring us to the next natural break in this build story and the end of video 2. If you're still here, thank you for watching. I hope that these are an interesting look behind the scenes, and fairly soon, I'm going to be able to update in video 3 all of the finishing details such as interior walls, exterior finish, lighting, and fixtures. Share the video with anyone who you think might like to see it. Till next time.